nomination, Mr. Bernhardt is no stranger to the body, he's no stranger to the Department of Interior. He's held a number of senior political positions in the agency during the Bush administration, beginning in 2006. And after leaving the department in 2009, he returned to a successful private practice. For 8 years, he's represented a wide range of clients, including oil and gas companies, mining companies, water supply interests in California, just to name a few. And if he's confirmed, he will oversee the same companies at the Department of Interior. That is, he will be making decisions on the same things that he lobbied for at the agency. Now he'll be on the other side of the table and be able, after a short period of time, to make decisions in these areas. So, as I said at his confirmation hearing, not suggesting that just working for the private sector disqualifies someone, but when you have a wide range of issues that you have worked on in the private sector and now you're going to be on the other side of the table, it brings up concerns. The President of the United States traveled the country when he was campaigning and said he wanted to drain the swamp from special interests. And he's repeated that many, many times over the last few years. But with Mr. Bernhardt's nomination, I'm afraid he's not draining the swamp. He's actually helping to fill it. The nominee's private sector experience as a registered lobbyist for companies whose main public policy focuses are in the Department of Interior, it creates an appearance of a conflict of interest, and the nominee wants to lead the department that he sued times. So it is true that Mr. Bernhardt has considerable experience. We saw another nominee come to this same post in a past administration on the same basis. People thought he had a lot of experience in a lot of these cases. But he obviously didn't follow the law and ended up going to jail because of his overreaching within the agency and organization. So these are very important public policy issues, public lands issues, interests that the American people need to make sure are above board and no conflicts of interest. Mr. Bernhardt served in the highest levels of the Department of Energy at a time when the Inspector General called it, quote, a culture of ethical failure, end quote. And I know that he, at the hearing, told us that he tried to help change that failure of culture within the agency. The Inspector General also testified that, quote, the ethics failures on the part of senior department officials, taking the form of appearances of impropriety and favoritism and bias, have been routinely dismissed with a promise not to do it again, end quote. So while Mr. Bernhardt has given testimony of the fact that he tried to help change and get away from that culture, I still have concerns that his private sector client base proposes a significant problem. The nominee's extensive client base in the area, which falls under the jurisdiction of the Department of Interior, creates at least an inherent appearance of conflict. His clients have lobbied extensively on such matters as the Cadiz pipeline in California, opening up the Arctic Wildlife Refuge to oil exploration, weakening the Endangered Species Act. He's advocated in favor of expanding offshore drilling and lifting the moratorium in the Gulf after the Deepwater Horizon disaster. And he's also represented the Westland Water District, the nation's largest irrigation district, as a registered lobbyist, and his law firm represented Westlands in 4 different lawsuits against the Department of Interior. In November of 2016, he joined the Trump transition team, and Mr. Bernhardt deregistered as a lobbyist for Westland, yet continued to work for them in some capacity. As the ranking member of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, I've raised concerns about these issues with the nominee during his hearing. He has submitted required financial disclosure, ethics reform, and ethics forms, but there are specific questions that we want to make sure are addressed. He has declined to comment on recusing himself beyond just the 1-year minimum that is required by the ethics rules. I know Mr. Bernhardt says that he'll comply with whatever the organization and agency requires, but we don't have the time of the long list of conflicts of interest, given that past case representation, to constantly know every issue and every meeting and every oversight to make sure that undue influence is not being pressured at the Department of Interior. The President of the United States, who nominated Mr. Bernhardt, told the Times just yesterday in a conversation about the Attorney General, if he was going to recuse himself, he should have just told me he would before he took the job, and I would pick someone else, end quote. Well, I hope that's not the issue here. I hope that the agency isn't running fast towards somebody who just won't recuse themselves in hopes that they will get someone who will do the bidding of these interests and not take into consideration the complexity, the legal structure, and the challenges that dealing with these issues take. In fact, as late as March of this year, Mr. Bernhardt's firm was submitting invoices to Westland for lobbying charges, which itemized expenses. Documents show he was engaged in regular contact with congressional offices working on legislation in efforts to inform administration policy. At the same time, he was serving on the Trump transition team. So the appearance that Mr. Bernhardt was still lobbying on behalf of clients that do business with the department at the same time he wants to help lead validates some of the concerns we've been saying. I remain concerned about his record on behalf of these corporations at the expense of the environment, his tenure at the Department of Interior, and many other challenges. The department's responsibility and jurisdictions are just too vast. They're too important to the American people just to green light someone who I believe will be very challenged in doing this job. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this nomination. But just today, a complaint was filed with the U.S. Attorney about this nominee's alleged lobbying activities based on new records available pursuant to public record law. So I want answers from the nominee. We're going to continue to ask questions. In the meantime, I ask my colleagues to oppose this nomination. Make sure that we get the answers we need before the nomination of David Bernhardt can continue. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.